Well, hello, this is John Stanford, your host from Making Medicine. We talk a lot about the Bayh-Dole Act on this podcast, and we're joined by someone instrumental to it. And so it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Joe Allen to the Making Medicine podcast. He's a 30-year veteran of national efforts to foster private and public sector commercialization partnerships. He's also the founder of Allen and Associates, a consulting firm that does exactly that and specializes in tech transfer issues. But most importantly, he was there for the early days of the Bayh-Dole Act. He was a professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee with former Senator Birch Bayh, and he was instrumental in the behind-scenes effort. And so we're lucky to have him here today. And of course, he's really championed that effort, celebrating the 40th year of the Bayh-Dole Act as executive director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition. So, Joe, thrilled to have you here today. Talk to us about what things were like 40 years ago when these conversations were happening and why it was such a pivotal moment for this policy.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on here. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today. Basically, when I joined the Senate Judiciary Committee, intellectual property was an afterthought if it was thought of at all. And just to show you how things were back then, on the Judiciary Committee, any patent issues fell under our Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee. So you can imagine how patents fared in a subcommittee like that. But that wasn't that unusual because the Senate Small Business Committee at that time was highly anti-patent. They viewed patent as a bludgeon by big business to keep small businesses down. The Justice Department was very much anti-patent. The U.S. patent system was pretty much in disarray. So when I worked for Senator Bayh, the old Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee had disappeared, and basically intellectual property issues came under Senator Bayh's subcommittee, the Subcommittee on the Constitution. But we didn't really have any plans for doing anything on patents, but that changed when Senator Bayh was a graduate of Purdue University. And one day we got a call from Purdue asking if they could come in and talk to us about a patent issue. And my general counsel said, "You want to sit in?" We had no idea what they were going to talk about. And Purdue said that basically under government policies, if the government funded any of the research, even a small percentage, if an invention was made, the government took it away, and it basically would just sit there because there was no incentive to develop it. And Purdue told us that they had made a couple inventions they thought were actually pretty significant, but they would never go anywhere. And they asked if Senator Bayh would look into the issue and see if he could help them. So we did. My general counsel asked me to look into it. And we found out that basically for the billions and billions of dollars invested by the government by taxpayers, hardly anything was being commercialized because we destroyed the patent incentives. We found that Senator Dole of Kansas, Senator Birch Bayh was a liberal Democrat. Bob Dole was a conservative Republican. We found that Dole had the same interests. So we agreed to work with Senator Dole's office to address it. And that's really how Bayh-Dole started, which really was the first sort of pro-patent legislation in the Senate Judiciary Committee probably in 25 years. So it really was a pretty bleak area back then. But once we looked into the issue, we could just see that patent rights were critical if you wanted to get government-funded research out of the laboratory, and so the public could use them.
Well, can we talk a little bit more about that? Because intellectual property, we know it's in the Constitution. We've talked a lot about its linkage to innovation. But can you explain a little bit more? Were we just letting things sit on shelves? Were we not seeing things? I think that hearing that Purdue really was the original grassroots movement for the Bayh-Dole Act is fascinating. What wasn't getting done, and how does IP fit into all of that?
Well, it's a critical issue, and it's something actually we're still debating today. So, in a lot of ways, the landscape today hasn't changed all that much. There still are people who are very much anti-patent, but in a nutshell, at the end of World War II, President Roosevelt asked Vannevar Bush, "What should we do with all this research capability the government had developed?" Because government research actually helped win the war. We had penicillin, we had jet engines, we had radar, a number of breakthroughs came through in the war. And Vannevar Bush said in his paper called Science, the Endless Frontier, that the government should fund basic science because it would help advance knowledge, and basically went to President Truman. He accepted that. They started the National Science Foundation, but almost immediately people started making inventions with government funding, and the question was, well, what do you do with them? And of course, at 1945-46, there really was, the United States was virtually the only economy still functioning. The rest of the world had been devastated by the war. So we had a Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe, and we also had a Marshall Plan of technology. And the thought was, if the government funds anything, we'll put it in the public domain. Everyone can use it. That will actually stimulate science. It will stimulate innovation. It was a very noble thought. The problem was it just didn't work because the government is not funding products. It's funding early stage research. And typically it's going to take a company 10 or 100 times as much to develop it as it did for the government to fund it. So what happened was almost immediately when these inventions were made, it became apparent that if somebody didn't have patent rights to them, either ownership or exclusive licensing, they weren't going to be developed. So they started a waiver process where you could petition the government to get an invention that you'd made waived back to you. The problem was it took like 2 years to get. It was a very cumbersome process, but that was sort of the precursor of actually starting the ball rolling toward Bayh-Dole. In 1968, President Johnson asked how many drugs had been commercialized from NIH, National Institutes of Health funding. And the Comptroller General came back and said, none. Not a single drug had been developed when the government took the rights away. So Johnson, he was like, that's completely unacceptable. So NIH started a policy called institutional patent agreements, where universities with a tech transfer office could actually own inventions they made with federal funding. And that started working very well. But what happened was in the Carter administration, they again went back to the sort of the anti-patent view, and they stopped the IPA program, which is what prompted Purdue to come and see Bayh-Dole. So basically what Bayh-Dole said was, listen, you've got to have patent rights to give somebody an incentive to take the risk that's going to be necessary to take a government-funded invention and turn it into a product. There also have to be incentives for the inventors and the organization that made it to work on commercialization. So in a nutshell, that's what Bayh-Dole did. We said we've been running this experiment for 40 years. We got 28,000 inventions sitting on the shelf. We're getting no drugs developed from NIH funding. And at the same time, we had Japan and Germany starting to eat our lunch technologically. So we said, listen, maybe this was a great policy back in 1945 when we had no competition, but we've got competition now, and we can't afford to squander the results of hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer-funded research.
So it was really sort of a market force. We were seeing a market failure by none of these things moving forward. Right. So did everyone jump up and say, of course, we have to do this? As you mentioned, there's always kind of been a strong anti-patent wing. So did you face a lot of opposition? And how did you get this done? And what role did Senator Bob Dole play in moving this forward?
Well, that's a great question, because again, in 1978, when we put this bill in, we thought, well, it's got to be better than what's going on right now because nothing is coming out the other end. Although the IPA program had shown that the concept of Bayh-Dole could work because universities were in fact licensing inventions that the government had not been able to license. We ran into a couple problems. One of which was we had people like Ralph Nader and Admiral Rickover. Rickover was the father of the nuclear navy, who basically felt that anything the government funded should be in the public domain, that patents were not necessary, that they were monopolies, and therefore they hated Bayh-Dole. We had another school of thought, which is back in 1978 and 79, Japan was the rising power, very much like China is right now. So a lot of people thought what we ought to do is emulate Japan and have an industrial policy where Washington and big businesses run the economy. And a lot of people in Washington love that model because obviously they're in Washington. So Bayh-Dole was just the opposite approach. What Bayh-Dole said was, if you make an invention with federal funding and you're a university or small company, you can own it. We gave the patent ownership to them. We gave them incentives for commercialization. We set a couple rules, and then we got the government out of the way. So Bayh-Dole was the anti-industrial policy approach. And so we had those two philosophical schools. But the other thing was there was no industry demand to work with universities because they'd never really done that. Before
Mm.
Bayh-Dole, if you're a company and you invested money in university and you made an invention, there's bound to be some federal funding flowing around that campus. So that invention will be taken away from you and be taken to the government where your rivals could use it for free. So one of the most nefarious parts of the pre-Bayh-Dole world was we had a segregation between our best minds in the public and private sectors. They would not work together because companies were afraid if we work with the university or federal laboratory, if we invent something, the government's going to take it away. So we really had a lot of forces going against us. But you mentioned Bob Dole, and I have tremendous respect for Senator Dole. He's 97 years old now, decorated veteran of World War II. And the combination of Bayh and Dole was magical because, first of all, they were well liked by their colleagues, but also we covered the ideological spectrum. I mean, Bayh was a well-respected Democrat, Dole was a well-respected Republican. But the other thing was, no matter which side of the aisle you were on, you had respect for people like Birch Bayh and Bob Dole. On Capitol Hill, we say there's two kinds of members of Congress. There's workhorses and show horses. The show horses are the people that are always out getting the publicity. The workhorses are the people that actually get things done. And Bayh and Dole were both workhorses. So I think we're able to work through a lot of the opposition because we had strong support from universities, and also we had a political combination that was magical. But getting Bayh-Dole through Congress was touch and go all the way through. I mean, there was 100 of times when it could have died, and luckily we were able to overcome a lot of opposition. But it was certainly not a cakewalk by any means.
So here we are 40 years later. I just think this historical context is so fascinating. How does something like this become a law? And I even, my background's in entrepreneurial policy. This was a small business bill. This was about because big industry was looking past the tech transfer offices. And I think we don't hear about that enough these days, that this was something for the little guy. This was a way for entrepreneurship to meet innovation. And I think that's incredible. And so what does the jury say? Here we are 40 years later. Has it been a success?
Well, I want to go back to the point you made, which is really a critical point. After we passed Bayh-Dole, one of the big things that had to happen was you had to actually build confidence that government and universities could be a reliable partner. And that was a hard thing to do. I think what changed that was when Stanford and University of California came up with the Boyer-Cohen patent, which is the basic biotech process. And what happened was, they own the patent rights, but there was no big demand to actually license that technology, even though it was available non-exclusively. It was a process patent. So Niels Reimers at Stanford had to go and meet with people individually. But what happened was, because biotech was so high risk, the large companies stayed away from it. So what happened was you had Genentech and other companies spin out of universities. So if you look at the biotech industry even today, it's characterized by small companies either spun out of universities or have licensed university technology. And I think that's what really opened the floodgates for Bayh-Dole. Once you started having that biotech revolution start with small companies being started, venture capital people now funding startup companies, the U.S. was number 3 in biotech when we passed Bayh-Dole. We suddenly became number 1. And I think that's what suddenly put tech transfer on the map, where then you really started having a big flood of companies once they saw somebody else doing it coming in. But like I said before, there was no demand. When we passed Bayh-Dole, we didn't have any industry people testifying that they really wanted to work with Stanford or MIT or anybody, because they were doing all the research internally. And what we found was, before Bayh-Dole, the people that really suffered by losing the patent rights were not the large contractors. They segregated their research between government work and commercial work. But we found a lot of small high-tech companies would not work with the government because if they did, they could lose their commercial standing. So the government was not really getting the best contractors. But Bayh-Dole now, I think, has been recognized as a success. The U.S. is leading the world in innovation. We're commercializing 3 new products and starting 3 new companies every day of the year from federally funded research. But there still are people, I mentioned Ralph Nader, his descendants, and are still fighting Bayh-Dole, and they'll tell you it's a failure. They're still going back trying to push that narrative that the government could micromanage the process, that government-funded inventions should be available to anybody. So, while the numbers are astounding what Bayh-Dole's done, we're still fighting a lot of the same battles now we were 40 years ago.
Well, which is incredible in a time where we're talking about we need economic recovery. We talk about small businesses are going to help the country bounce back. And of course, at the end of all of this, life sciences and the pharmaceutical industry really drove the vaccine response and the treatment response to coronavirus. So it's so paradoxical to me that of all the
Right.
times we're having this. But one of the things that I know you've talked about, because you testified in front of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, you testified alongside Incubate, and you made a lot of great points about this misunderstanding with the law that I know opposition really seizes onto, and this idea of march-in rights. And I thought you made so many good points that it's something I want to talk to you about. Can you just give a little sense of march-in rights? And you were there. What was the original intent when it comes to march-in rights?
Well, that's a great question. I mentioned before that even before Bayh-Dole, you had a policy where you could petition the government to get rights to own your invention. And what happened was when the government granted that petition, they had march-in rights. And the march-in rights provision simply is to make sure that you're making good faith efforts to commercially develop a federally funded invention, which has always been, one of the goals of all the policies. You want to make sure these things are actually being used so the taxpayers can have access to them. So Bayh-Dole didn't invent march-in rights. So when we passed Bayh-Dole, we built on what had gone before. We used a lot of the same language. And again, the thrust of Bayh-Dole was we're going to let you own the invention. We're going to let universities license it. They give a preference to small companies, give a preference for people that are manufacturing in the United States. But we want to make sure that, in fact, good faith efforts are being made to develop the technology. So Bayh-Dole has 4 triggers where the government could march in. And marching in means the government can go to the university and say, listen, you got to license some other people because for whatever reason, this licensee is not getting the job done. So 3 of the triggers apply to the invention owner, which is typically a university, and the licensee, which is a company. One is, can you meet the needs of a national emergency? Maybe you've commercialized it, but you have COVID breakout. We have to buy hundreds of millions of dollars hundreds of millions of doses. Can you produce enough? That would be one march-in. If you couldn't do it, the government could march in and license other people. The other one is, okay, can you meet the needs of a government regulation? The same criteria. Can you produce enough? Can you do what it's needed to do? The third one is, did you violate your pledge that you would make it in the United States? So those apply to the patent owner and the licensee. Where the controversies come out is the first trigger, which only applies to the patent owner, which is a university. Because remember, when we passed Bayh-Dole, a lot of universities have never licensed technology before because they didn't have tech transfer offices. So the concern was, are these people going to be taken advantage of by some dominant company to go in and license the technology just to prevent it from being commercialized? And also we wanted to make sure that universities license these things on reasonable terms, to make sure that you're not putting crazy things in there, like, paying for our football field to license the technology. So the first trigger says to make sure that the technology being brought to the market for practical application on reasonable terms. And reasonable terms means the terms of the license. And you can tell that because it only applies to the patent owner. Okay, so that's how the laws work for 20 years. 20 years after Bayh-Dole passed, opponents of the law came up with they claimed they found a new meaning, that reasonable terms meant that the government could enforce reasonable pricing. And I remember when I read this in the Loyola Law Review, I laughed at it because it was so off the wall. And what these guys did was they quoted not the Bayh-Dole hearing, but other anti-patent hearings that I mentioned to you before. We had other people that didn't like patents. So they quoted their hearings, and then they quoted the opponents of Bayh-Dole in our hearings and said, aha, we found this magical thing that no one's known for 20 years. Well, when the Washington Post ran an op-ed endorsing that view, I had Senator Bayh and Senator Dole write a rebuttal to it. And we said, no, that's not how the law works. The law has nothing about reasonable pricing. Reasonable terms means to make sure that the technology being licensed reasonably. In other words, you're having terms and conditions in there that are conducive to development, and also that you're enforcing the license to make sure that somebody is in fact meeting the milestones to show they're being developed. Well, and the other thing that should tell you something is when a theory comes up by the opponents of the law, by the people that try to kill the law, it should certainly be viewed very skeptically. So the people pushing this idea that the government can march in to control prices are people that don't like Bayh-Dole. They're the same people who oppose every exclusive license from NIH. They're the same people who attack the people who are developing vaccines right now. I mean, if you look at whatever company is coming forward now with a new vaccine or a new breakthrough, these same people are attacking them, saying the patent should be taken away. So these are the people that have been basically saying that Bayh-Dole should be used for price control, and they've actually formed petitions under Bayh-Dole. Anybody can petition the government to march in, and each of their petitions has been dismissed by Democratic and Republican administrations because it's not how the law works. But unfortunately, they've done a great job working with the media and with other people to convince people that, in fact, there's this hidden part of Bayh-Dole that allows the government to control prices, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So we spend a lot of time now just educating people about that. In fact, you mentioned the Bayh-Dole Coalition. We're actually having a webinar next week on the 25th on march-in rights. But, again, it seems like an obscure issue. It's really not that hard if you look at what the law says. But we've got a lot of people that have been very successful working with the media that, in fact, that Bayh-Dole allows the government to set prices after you've commercialized something just because somebody doesn't like it. And that couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, and I think from Incubate's perspective, as the voice of life science investors, we don't like hidden loopholes. We don't like unpredictability. We're taking on these high risk investments. And so it's just really good to hear and see the work that you've been doing for the Bayh-Dole Coalition, but also your entire career to say, this is what the law meant. And that law has been a fantastic success from the perspective of patients, from the perspective of entrepreneurs, from the perspective that America is now, without a doubt, the global biopharmaceutical leader. And so it was such a pleasure to hear you speaking before the Department of Commerce on that front, on why getting through, this is what the law says, this is what we meant, and maybe hopefully putting that to rest. And I love that point you made that Democratic and Republican administrations alike have universally rejected these appeals. And I just think that's such a good point. The honestly, Joe, I'm just so thrilled that you've been able to come on the podcast today. It's been a pleasure and, quite frankly, an honor to have someone with your background and experience in something that's so integral to everything here at Incubate that we do. If listeners want to keep up with your work and celebrate Bayh-Dole with you, how can they get involved? How can they stay in touch with the coalition, and how can they learn more?
Well, you can get on our website, which is BayhDoleCoalition.com or .org. And we welcome anybody to join. There's no fee to join. We just want to make sure that we're building as broad-based a coalition as possible. The reason we formed the coalition and Incubate is one of our valued members is we have to educate people on these issues, because the fact is the law is 40 years old and people don't know the background. And if I can just make one other point on march-in rights, it's anti-small business. 50% of our drugs are made by small companies, and no one is going to fund a small company if, in fact, by the time you get a product on the market, which, as you know, is very hard to do, anybody could come back and say, we don't like your price, and license your competitors. No VC would ever fund a company like that. So it's not going to hurt big pharma as much as it's going to kill small tech startups. So we really appreciate the work that Incubate's doing. And, again, what we're trying to do is just educate people on the law, educate people on the importance. And as you said before, one of the amazing things we've had, a miracle really, is in the COVID-19, we immediately had our public and private sectors come together seamlessly. That would not have happened without Bayh-Dole. And the fact that we've got vaccines being developed in 6 months is miraculous, literally miraculous. So we ought to be praising the system that developed that, not looking at taking it apart and saying, if somebody comes up with a miraculous cure, the first thing we want to do is take it away from them. We ought to be thanking them from the bottom of our hearts for actually saving the world.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I do encourage folks to follow up, be a part of sort of the awareness work that Joe Allen is leaving. He is one of the godfathers of the Bayh-Dole Act. He was there, and it is the fundamental underpinning of the tech transfer process. We know that so much of the basic science is done in universities, and it drives commercialization and entrepreneurship. So we were just thrilled to have you, Joe. Thank you again to all of our listeners for listening to Making Medicine. Keep listening, keep sharing feedback. Let us know what you want to hear on the show. More from Incubate is at www.incubatecoalition.org. And a special thanks to Ashlyn Roberts and Olivia Lucani in making today's podcast. We're going to keep focusing on innovation, and hopefully you'll stay part of the conversation. Thanks.